Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own All Secrets Keep or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lisbeth_1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Celine.
All Secrets Keep, Chapter 18. The door to the war room opened, and, somehow, the tension in the room seemed to increase. Sarah's entire body was stiff. Each muscle tensed to the point of pain, and her jaw was clenched so tight she could hear her teeth creaking together. Her hands were folded together behind her back, and she stood straight and stiff as a board behind Petra. She didn't recognize the woman who entered the room, but she still knew who it was. Even in a body that wasn't her own, Nycta's arrogance and gait were immediately recognizable. "Hey, Bells." The voice wasn't Nycta's either, but the leering tone couldn't have belonged to anyone else. "One of your officers said that you needed my—" Nycta suddenly stopped talking and took a step back, looking as if she had been slapped. The blue eyes that didn't belong to her were staring straight at Sarah, wide and unblinking. "What the hell?" Her eyes flicked back and forth between Sarah and Petra. "You're supposed to be dead." "And in a perfect world, you would be as well," Sarah hissed back through clenched teeth. Nycta's lip curled, and she opened her mouth to retort, but Petra's voice interrupted her. "Nick." Petra's tone was soft, causing Nycta to immediately deflate. Turning to look over at her, Sarah narrowed her eyes at it. "We need your help." Nycta took another step backwards, holding up her hands. "I'm sorry, we?" She had turned to fully face Petra now. "No," she shook her head. "You know better than to ask this of me," she said angrily. "I'm not helping her." She spun on her heel and turned to leave, but Petra's desperate voice stopped her. "Tally Craven has been taken." Nycta froze before slowly turning back around, brow furrowed. "What?" "Tally Craven has been taken," Petra repeated, voice quieter this time. "By who? And why?" "The Camarilla. They wish to exchange her life for Sarah's." A puzzled look crossed Nycta's face, and she chanced a glance at Sarah, who was still glaring at her. "That doesn't make any sense. Why the hell would they think that she would trade her life for a single cadet?" Petra cleared her throat, looking down at her feet. The puzzled look on Nycta's face suddenly increased. Then her eyes widened. Her head snapped to look over at Sarah. "You went and fell in love?" It was a statement, not a question. Nycta already knew the answer. "I shouldn't be surprised. You always did have a soft spot for her," she sneered. "You had every opportunity to end her life when she declared right of proxy, and had it been anyone else, you would have. But it was clear to everyone that you were holding back during that fight. You should have seen the look on your face when she first stepped forward." Sarah gave no response, other than a muscle twitching in her jaw. "So, what does this have to do with me?" Nycta turned back to Petra, once again ignoring Sarah. "You need me to pretend someone, right?" "Yes," Petra answered, looking back up. "Sarah, to be specific." A stunned laugh fell out of Nicta's mouth. I'm sorry, you're going to give me Sarah Alder's face. To what end? You're going to pretend to be Sarah and turn yourself over to the Camarilla. Once they have you, if they stay true to their word, they will release Tally, and then the real Sarah and I, along with the team, will step in. We will get both you and Tally out alive, Petra promised. Nicta had a look on her face like she had just tasted something sour, but she didn't break eye contact from Petra as she stared, face contorted with displeasure. A tense few moments passed before she inhaled sharply and rolled her eyes. Fine, she bit out, but I am not doing this for her. Her eyes didn't leave Petra's, even as she jabbed a finger in Sarah's direction. I am doing this for you, and for Tally. She risked her life for me when she stopped my execution, so I will do the same for her. Thank you. The words were not spoken by Petra, but by Sarah. Nicta blinked in surprise, turning to look at her. Some of the tension had receded from Sarah's body. Her teeth were no longer grinding against each other, but she was still standing painfully straight, hands still clasped behind her back. Nicta quickly looked away, scowling. When do we leave? In a few hours. We're waiting on the team to get ready, Petra replied smoothly, keeping her voice calm as if she were afraid of making Nicta angry again. The team, Sarah and myself, will not be visible to you or anyone else right away. You'll need to pretend like you came alone. General Bellwether. Isadora's normally calm voice was hurried as she pushed back through the door of the war room. I found some intel that I believe we should take advantage of. Nicta, who had started at Isadora's voice, stepped back several paces into the room, caught somewhat awkwardly between Isadora and Sarah. She looked supremely uncomfortable and shifted closer to Petra. What is it? Petra motioned to Isadora to continue speaking. There is a Camarilla encampment 5 miles south of the warehouse where the exchange will be taking place. I believe that is where they are currently holding Tally. It's not large, but there is a considerable Camarilla presence there. Isadora glanced at the strange soldier standing so close to Petra. She looked mildly confused, but she didn't mention it. I think it would be a good idea to send a strike team there to wipe them out while the exchange is taking place. They don't know that we know they have set up base there. It would be a good idea to take them by surprise as well. Petra pursed her lips, considering. I think you may be right. We can't involve too many people in this mission, however. Isadora, tell the strike team that is assigned to the mission that their new orders are to take down the Camarilla base. If they need assistance, we can meet up with them after we secure Craven's safety. Then who is going to help us? Sarah asked sharply. Petra turned around to look at her with a small smile on her face. Our daughters. Tally shivered in the cold night air. The warehouse was completely empty on the inside, hollowed out and left to rot with gaping holes on the walls that allowed for the bitter wind of the Massachusetts winter to blow through. She was still dressed only in the clothes she had been taken in, a thin, grey shirt and sleep shorts, and she hadn't stopped shivering since they had arrived at the warehouse an hour ago. She was slowly losing feeling in her hands and feet, all of her muscles stiff and tensed in the cold to the point of pain. There were 10 Camarilla guards scattered around the warehouse, 4 of them guarding her alone, as if the fact that she was still tied up and freezing wasn't enough to make her not seem like a threat. The thin man who had made the demand to Sarah was pacing around the warehouse, constantly glancing at his watch. Tally hoped Sarah wouldn't show up. She didn't want Sarah to sacrifice herself for her. She didn't think that she could bear the thought of knowing she was the reason that Sarah Alder, the woman she loved, was dead. For real this time. She thought that just might kill her. Do you think this is going to work? Riel's nervous voice broke the silence on the back of the military truck. Her leg was bouncing nervously, and she was clutching her hands in her lap. "It has to," Abigail said. She sounded more confident than she felt. Sarah was leaning forward in her seat, elbows resting on her knees. She felt sick. She felt terrified. She couldn't remember the last time she had been so worried about something. Her hand reached down and absent-mindedly squeezed her scourge, the tight leather creaking beneath her grip. It didn't do much to alleviate her stress. "It's a good plan." Anacostia's voice was steady, reassuring. Her presence next to Sarah in the truck was the only thing keeping her sane. As long as Nicta does as she's told and follows the plan, it will be fine. "She will." Petra's voice was harsher than she had intended it to be, and everyone turned to look at her. She sighed, looking down at the ground. "She wants to help Telly. We can trust that." "If Telly dies, I'm killing Nicta myself." Sarah's voice was a low hiss. She didn't look up as she spoke, staring ahead at the wall, still keeping a tight grip on her scourge. "Nobody is dying tonight," Petra said loudly. Sarah shot a glance at Petra, eyes narrowing. She looked like she wanted to say something, but Anacostia laid a hand gently on her shoulder, and Sarah exhaled loudly instead, turning back to stare at the side of the truck. The truck slowed to a stop, brakes squealing, and everyone in the back of the truck tensed, all eyes turning to Petra. The seconds crawled by slowly, Sarah's chest tightening with each one until Petra nodded, looking up at Sarah. "It's time." Sarah inhaled sharply, and then exhaled, a low seed flowing from her mouth, and the air around the 5 women in the back of the truck began to shimmer and distort, leaving an orange glare to the world around them. Raelle looked around in amazement. "Is this what it's like all the time?" she asked in a hushed voice. Sarah just nodded tightly. "Stay close and stay quiet," she whispered. "We can't let anyone know we're here until Telly is released. If you get too far away from me, you won't be cloaked anymore." Raelle's eyes were wide, but she nodded. Sarah glanced around at everyone one last time before hopping out of the truck. She could see herself, no, Nicta, slowly making her way to the large metal doors of the warehouse, and she quickly motioned for everyone to follow her. They made their way slowly and quietly after Nicta, making sure to keep their distance, but to also stay close enough so they could be prepared to strike when ready. Nicta and Sarah's body slowly opened the heavy metal doors to the warehouse. The metal creaked and groaned as she forced the doors open, and then, suddenly, there was a shout from the inside, one that made Sarah go weak in the knees. "No!" Telly's anguished scream could be heard clearly, even from outside the warehouse, where the rest of them stood waiting. "No, you can't do this, please!" Sarah hadn't even realized she had taken a step forward at the sound of Telly's voice, until a hand, cold and clammy, grabbed her wrist, stopping her. She whipped her head around to find Raelle clutching at her wrist, shaking her head. "You can't," the girl whispered. "Sarah, please, don't do this." Raelle's grip on Sarah's wrist tightened at the sound of Telly's echoed cries, and Sarah turned away from looking at her, clamping a hand over her own mouth to muffle the quiet sob that she couldn't hold back. She could feel Telly's fear, Telly's terror as she looked at who she thought was Sarah, getting ready to sacrifice herself for Telly's life. It was the same fear she herself had felt when faced with the prospect of Telly dying. "Telly." Sarah's hand dropped from her mouth at the sound of her own voice coming from inside the warehouse, where Nicta, pretending to be her, had spoken. "It's going to be okay, Telly. I promise." Sarah's voice was reassuring as it came from Nicta. "Everything is going to be all right." No, please, I can't live without you. Tally was growing louder, sobbing. From where they were waiting outside, Sarah couldn't see Tally, but she could see Nicta being handcuffed and forced to her knees by 3 Camarilla agents. Look at me, Tally, Nicta said slowly, calmly, even as one of the agents put a collar around her neck. It's going to be okay. Just look at me. Tally's sobs halted, and Sarah could feel her processing Nicta's words, Nicta's order to look. And so Tally looked. A jolt of realization went through her and echoed through Sarah outside as Tally looked with her side, and the air around the Sarah that was inside the warehouse seemed to move and dance with work until it faded away, and Tally realized that she wasn't looking at Sarah at all, but Nicta. Confusion replaced fear, and she stared at Nicta, wide-eyed, tears still streaming down her face. You have me, Nicta said slowly, finally addressing the Camarilla agents in the room. Now, let her go. The thin man walked slowly over to Nicta, smiling. Oh, don't worry. We will. But I think it would be more fun to make her watch us kill you first. I think, Nicta said slowly, a sneer appearing on her face. It looked horrible out of place on Sarah's face. That you should let her go first, before something happens that you'll regret. The man barked out a sharp laugh. And who are you to do anything? You may be the great General Alder, but you are in no position to make any threats. A dark smile grew on Nicta's face. That's where you're wrong. The man smirked. You think you're capable of making good on any of your threats right now? No. Nicta slowly shook her head, Sarah's blue eyes burning as they stared up at him. I meant, I'm not General Alder. There was a harsh sound, followed by a loud metallic groan and a snap, and then a gust of wind flew through the warehouse as the metal doors were blown entirely off the hinges, scattering across the floor, catching 2 Camarilla agents as they flew by. The man who had taunted Nicta whirled around, eyes going wide in surprise, as Petra appeared out of nowhere, another wind strike already leaving her mouth. He flew back across the room with a yell, hitting the wall behind Tally with a sickening splat. "Kill Craven!" a voice shouted from somewhere in the warehouse. The Camarilla agent closest to Tally suddenly turned on her, yanking a service knife out of his belt as he did so. He had barely taken a step toward her when there was a loud snarl. It almost wasn't human, and he was suddenly cleaved in two, an unseen force splitting his body clean in half. Tally screamed, lurching backwards, her bindings tugging painfully at her wrists and ankles. Her whole body was shaking from head to toe, but whether it was more from fear or the cold, she wasn't sure. There was a shimmer to her left, Tally's head whipping to the side to look at it properly, and then Tally let out a choked sob of relief, body going weak as Sarah became visible, looking absolutely furious. She was in her combat gear, hand clenched tightly around her scourge, and the same guttural snarl left her mouth as she took out another Camarilla agent in the same fashion she had just taken out the one who had been going to kill Tally. A hand grabbed Tally's wrists behind her, and she screamed again before a familiar wave of dark hair entered her field of view. "Tally!" Abigail's eyes were wide. "It's okay. We got you." She knelt down, quickly taking the bindings off of Tally's feet, Riel working desperately to free Tally's wrists. Tally's eyes were glued to the scene, just over Abigail's head. Anacostia and Sarah were taking out the rest of the Camarilla agents, Sarah's scourge slicing through 2 of them with practiced ease, an angry yell leaving her mouth as she did so. Behind them both, Petra was busy freeing Nicta from her own bindings, eyes darting about to make sure they weren't snuck up on. Much like Tally had been able to only a few weeks before, she could feel Sarah's emotions echoing in her chest. Only this time it wasn't a soft and tender love. It was a bright and searing, all-consuming rage that left Tally breathless, her head spinning. Her skin crawled with the sheer force of it. Sarah screamed again, throwing both her arms forward in a slashing motion. And there was a loud crack. Tally's ears popped, and the hair on her arms stood up as a lightning, black and sharp, with a stench of ozone, shot out of Sarah's fingertips towards the last few remaining Camarilla. Rael and Abigail finished untying Tally, and they each grabbed one of her arms, hauling her to her feet. Sarah's rage was still boiling in Tally's chest, making it hard to breathe, and she could see Sarah, tense and breathing hard, head whipping around the room as if she were looking for another target. Her face was contorted into a snarl, angrier than Tally had ever seen her, blue eyes dark. "God, Estelle, you're freezing," she heard Rael murmur from next to her. Tally stumbled against her sisters, nearly frozen feet making it impossible to walk properly. But she stumbled forward again, eyes locked onto the furious woman in front of her. "Sarah," she choked out. Sarah's whole body shifted at the sound of Tally's voice, spinning in place on her feet till she was facing her. She sucked in a ragged breath, scourge dropping to the ground with a clatter, and the burning anger in her eyes disappeared, taking the fury storming in Tally's chest with it. The adrenaline, because it had been Sarah's adrenaline, coursing through her veins, Tally realized, suddenly dissipated, and Tally staggered forward, head spinning. Sarah was there in an instant, strong arms wrapping around Tally, and Abigail and Rael stepped back, allowing Tally to collapse into Sarah's arms with a cry. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, as Tally began to sob against her, arms wrapping tightly around Sarah's neck. "You're safe now. I've got you." Tally's body was freezing against hers, whole body shaking. Sarah gently lifted Tally up, arm hooking underneath her legs, and she knelt down on the ground, setting Tally on the floor in front of her. Tally's lips and the tips of her fingers were turning blue, dried blood still on her face from where she had been beaten. Sarah quickly shrugged off her combat jacket and wrapped it around Tally's shivering frame, a seed of warming spilling from her mouth. It wouldn't undo any of the damage the cold had already done to Tally's body, but it would keep her warm and prevent any more from happening. Tally stopped shivering as much, but her hands were still ice cold as they reached out for Sarah and grabbed onto her arms. "You came after me." Her fingers gripped Sarah's arms hard enough to bruise. Sarah's heart lurched in her chest at Tally's words, and she pulled the younger woman closer to her again, feeling Tally fist her hands into Sarah's shirt and bury her face into Sarah's neck, clinging to her, desperately. "Of course I did. I will always come after you." She leaned her forehead against the top of Tally's head. "There is nothing I would not do to keep you safe." "We should get out of here." Sarah shifted slightly from where she was knelt on the ground, arms tightening around Tally so that she stayed pressed up against her. It was Petra who had spoken, standing next to Nicta, who was now, thankfully, looking like herself once again, even if she was still dressed in a spare pair of Sarah's combat gear. "We should get back to Fort Salem." Petra spoke again, gesturing to Tally. Sarah stood up, still keeping a tight grip on Tally as she did though, lifting her effortlessly. "Yes, we need to get her to safety." Tally shivered once again when they stepped out into the open night air, burrowing further into both Sarah's jacket and her arms as a cold breeze flew by. Sarah could feel Abigail and Rael quickly following behind her, not wanting to get too far from Tally, but not willing to try to take her from Sarah's arms either, most likely knowing that she wouldn't even let them try. "Abigail, start the truck, please," Sarah said tightly. "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said quickly, rushing past Sarah to open the driver's side door and clambering up inside. The truck started with a roar, and Sarah shifted Tally to support her with one arm as she opened up the passenger side door. She set Tally gently down onto the seat, hand going to brush her cheek softly. Her thumb brushed over the cut on Tally's cheek, and a flicker of anger sparked in her chest again, before Tally grabbed at her wrist, eyes wide. "No." Her voice was still thick with tears, but her tone was more firm. "I'm fine, Sarah. You saved me. I'm gonna be okay." "They hurt you because of me." Sarah's touch on Tally's skin was still gentle, despite the angry hiss in her voice. Tally's grip on her wrist tightened. "And you saved me," she repeated. "I'm okay now." Her eyes were looking up at Sarah, pleading. "I'm okay, please." Sarah took a deep breath, eyes closing, forcing herself to calm down. "Okay." "General," Anacostia's voice sounded from behind Sarah, and she turned to look at her. "What is it?" "The strike team is asking for backup. They haven't started the attack yet. There are apparently more Camarilla agents hiding away there than we had anticipated." Anacostia was standing at attention. "They are asking for your assistance." Sarah nodded, her back straightening. Tally's grip on her wrist remained there. "Tell them General Bellwether and I will be there shortly to help." Anacostia nodded and turned away. "Wait!" Tally's panicked voice had Sarah quickly turning around to look at her again. "You're leaving?" Sarah brushed her thumb over Tally's cheek again. "We have the location of where they were holding you. We need to go wipe them out." Her voice sounded strangely calm. Tally's other hand reached out to grab at Sarah's waist. "But do you have to go?" "Tally," Sarah said gently, but she felt that spark of anger in her chest again. "They took you from me." Her voice threatened to shake with anger, but she kept it steady, not wanting to upset Tally again. "They hurt you and held you captive and tried to use you against me." Her hand that wasn't on Tally gripped the seat of the truck underneath her, knuckles turning white from the force. "I am going to make them pay." "Please don't go," Tally begged, her brown eyes wide as they looked up at Sarah. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her heart breaking at Tally's words. "They need my help. Your sisters and Anacostia will take you back to Fort Salem and make sure you are safe. I will be back soon. I promise." She pried Tally's cold hand off of her wrist and stepped away from the truck. She had taken no more than a few steps away from the vehicle before she heard Abigail shout, "Tally, no!" Sarah whirled back around to see Tally stumbling out of the truck after her, Sarah's slightly too big coat still wrapped around her shoulders. "Tally." Tally lurched forward, grabbing at Sarah, wrapping her arms around her middle and looking up at her desperately, eyes wide with tears. "Please don't go. Please don't leave me." Her voice cracked as the tears started to spill from her eyes. "Please don't make me go back to Fort Salem without you." Sarah took a shaky breath, feeling tears of her own appear. She closed her eyes against them, folding her arms around Tally, squeezing her tight. Tally sobbed once again, and Sarah pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing Tally's scent in deeply. "Please don't leave me." She heard Tally beg against her shoulder again. Sarah lifted her head and opened her eyes. Her throat ached from holding back tears of her own, but she couldn't afford to start crying, not now. "Color?" Her voice was strangled, barely able to get the girl's name out around the lump in her throat. "Yes, ma'am," the girl said quietly, seeming to understand what Sarah was asking without her needing to say anything. The blonde stepped forward, as Sarah once again disentangled herself from Tally's embrace, and Rael grabbed Tally's waist firmly, holding her back. "No!" Tally's eyes widened, and she reached out for Sarah, who had taken a step back, but she was held firmly in place by Rael. "No, Sarah, no! Don't do this to me!" "I'm sorry, Tally." Sarah forced herself to take another step back, even though every muscle in her body was screaming at her, aching to go back to Tally, to take her into her arms and comfort her, to never let her go again. "But they need my help." "But I need you, Sarah, please." Tally was still struggling against Rael's grip, Rael's arms slipping around her waist from behind to hold her more firmly in place. "Please don't leave me." "Come on, Tal. We need to go." Rael started to tug Tally back towards the truck. "I'm sorry," Sarah said again. Her heart broke a little more with every one of Tally's cries. "I will be back, I promise. I love you." She steeled herself against Tally's sobs and turned away, making her way stiffly over to where Petra and Nikta were waiting. Nikta was watching the whole situation curiously, and Petra was staring at the ground. "Let me go, Rael! Let me go!" Tally's echoed cries had Sarah gritting her teeth, clenching her hands together. "Sarah! Sarah!" "Tally, come on," Rael grunted. There was another loud sob, and the sound of the truck door slamming shut, Tally's cries being silenced behind the heavy metal door. It was taking everything she had in her not to turn and run back to Tally, but she knew she couldn't. She couldn't leave the strike team to fend for themselves against the Camarilla, and if she were being honest with herself, part of her was still burning with rage and anger for what they had done to Tally. She was going to make them regret ever taking Tally from her. She took a deep breath, stoking the angry fire in her chest, and stopped just in front of Petra and Nikta, fists clenching at her side. "Ready, General Bellwether?" Petra looked up, but she wasn't given the chance to speak before she was interrupted by Nikta's voice. "I'm coming too." Both Sarah and Petra blinked at Nikta in surprise, Sarah's lip curling slightly in disgust. Nikta caught her expression and rolled her eyes. "You need all the help you can get, Sarah, and I already behaved so far, haven't I? Your girl is alive because of me." "Sarah," Petra interrupted whatever Sarah had been going to say next, reaching up to place a hand on Nikta's shoulder. "We could use her. She's useful, and you know it." "She's also untrustworthy," Sarah hissed back. "She's helped us so far," Petra argued. "She's coming, and that's final." She squeezed Nikta's shoulder lightly before letting go, nodding to Sarah as she did so. "Now come on, let's not waste any more time."
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.